The last chain gave way above her with a sound too vast to belong to metal. It tore through the dying city like the cracking of a mountain, and then the whole sky lurched. Lira Voss staggered on the broken bridge, one hand clamped over the gash in her side, and watched the anchor towers fail one after another through curtains of ash. Each tower had held for centuries. Each had been named, blessed, fed with iron and blood and prayer. Now they split with impossible white fire crawling through their seams, and the chain city swung drunkenly over the abyss while streets folded, houses sheared loose, and thousands vanished into the red storm below. The air burned her throat. Smoke and pulverized stone turned every breath into something ragged and wet. She could still hear them even over the collapse, the scream of draft beasts in their harnesses, the shrill temple bells rung by hands already dead, Captain Wren shouting for a retreat that had come 3 years too late. A child had clung to her coat an hour ago, soot-streaked and silent with terror, and Lira had pried those fingers loose to pass him into another pair of arms. She did not know if either of them had made it. She did not know if anyone had. The thought struck deeper than the wound. All the years of preparing, all the names memorized, all the bargains made in alley shadows and council chambers, and still the city was ending exactly as it had promised it would. A flare of that unnatural light opened in the clouds beneath the chains. It was not lightning. Lightning obeyed storms. This thing unfolded like a wound in the world, pale at the center and ringed with colors her eyes could not hold. The abyss answered it. Something vast moved far below, stirring layers of ash that had not settled in generations, and the surviving chains shrieked as if the metal itself felt fear. Lira braced herself against a tilting parapet and forced her failing sight toward the western span where the final evacuation line should have been. There was only fire there, and falling debris, and the memory of faces she had sworn to bring through this. She laughed once and blood came up with it, hot across her teeth. Of all the cruel jokes the world had kept, this was the sharpest. She had survived the famine winters, the plague camps, the purges in the lower wards, only to die with the knowledge of exactly how everything had gone wrong and no strength left to turn even one piece of it aside. Her legs gave under her. She dropped to one knee on shattered stone. Around her the bridge canted harder, chains grinding, bolts screaming from their housings. She thought of her brother's hand slipping from hers in floodwater, of Mara with an arrow through her neck, still trying to rise, of old Tavin in the archive vault, pushing records into her arms while the ceiling came down. The dead crowded close in the smoke, not accusing, not forgiving, only present. Then the light found her. It speared through ash and ruin and marrow alike, clean as winter, and every nerve in her body clenched. The bridge vanished. The pain in her side became all pain, all heat, all force, as if invisible hooks had sunk into bone and memory together and were dragging both backward through a space too narrow for either to survive. Lira tried to scream, but the sound tangled with the tolling bells, with the chain-break thunder, with voices from years already lost. Her heart convulsed. Her last breath tasted of cinders and hot iron. She came back choking. Darkness pressed low overhead instead of open sky. Cold stone dug into her shoulder. The smoke was thinner here, old and greasy, trapped in walls that had held it for decades, but it was smoke all the same, and she gagged as she rolled onto her side. Her body moved wrong, too fast, too light. The wound in her flank was gone, yet she could still feel it, phantom deep, a line of remembered agony under unbroken skin. Her hands were smaller. The knuckles bore no white ridge scars. The old break in her left wrist did not ache. Panic hit so sharply she crabbed backward until her spine struck a support pillar slick with condensation. A single lamp burned at the far end of the chamber, its wick low, its flame amber and ordinary. Storage alcoves cut into the bedrock. Rusted hooks. A pile of coal sacks. The underside of the old city. Not the war rooms beneath the eastern bastion where she had died, but the forgotten service hollows under the tanner's steps where she had slept sometimes before she had coin enough for a room. 10 years peeled open inside her all at once. She knew this chamber. knew the hairline crack in the pillar beside her, knew the drip that fell every seventh breath into the cracked basin by the wall, knew, with a horror that made her teeth chatter, who she had been the last time she woke here. Lira pushed herself upright and nearly overshot the motion. Young muscles answered without the drag of old injuries. Her lungs filled deeper than they had in years. Her hair, hacked short in the future for battle and lice, spilled longer around her face when she touched it. She stared at her own fingers in the lampglow, opening and closing them as if they belonged to a stranger. The memories had not blurred. Ren was still dead. Mara was still dead. The city had still fallen. But those things now existed inside a body that had not yet lived them, and the wrongness of that split made the room tilt worse than any collapsing bridge. On the floor near the bedding lay a folded scrap she remembered too well. A debt notice stamped with the Cooper's seal, due on market 3rd. Beside it, a crust of black bread wrapped in cloth and a cheap tin cup half full of stale water. She snatched up the notice with trembling hands and read the date once, twice, then again until the numbers stopped swimming. 9th of Imberwick, year 312. 10 years. Exactly 10 years before the chains broke. 3 days before the fire in the dye district that everyone would call an accident. 3 days before the first name on her list died for nothing. Lira looked up at the low stone ceiling as if she might see through it to the city above, whole and ignorant and already walking toward its first wound, and forced herself to stand before the shaking in her legs could become fear enough to keep her here. The stair from the service hollow climbed through wet stone and old soot, turning twice before it found the grated door that opened into the waking dark of the lower wards. Lira slipped through it and pulled the iron back into place without a sound. The air above carried the city in layers: coal smoke from the night kilns, sour yeast from the first ovens, fish brine from the canal carts, and underneath all of it the cold mineral breath of the chain shafts. Dawn had not yet broken, but the city was never fully asleep. Somewhere overhead, far above the stacked alleys and roof lines, the great anchor chains groaned in their housings with the slow complaint of mountains forced to move. She kept her head down and her stride even. Panic still darted in her chest like a trapped thing, but discipline settled over it piece by piece, the way armor had once settled over her shoulders. Count the steps, mark the corners, watch reflections in shuttered glass. The lower wards had not changed yet. Rope lines sagged between leaning buildings. Rainwater glimmered black in broken stones. The upper city's wealth pressed down in architecture alone. Even from here she could feel it in the heavy shadow of the merchant quarter bridges that crossed above, carrying silk, spice, polished boots and men who had once looked straight through her when she tried to warn them. Back then she had been hungry, angry, forgettable, in some ways that had kept her alive longer than trust would have. At the end of Chainmaker's Row, she paused beside a boarded tannery window and looked east, where the main suspension towers rose through the dark like the ribs of some dead god. Their iron anchors plunged into the bedrock beneath the city and held the high districts over the gorge, each link thicker than a man's torso, black with age and grease. In 10 years those anchors would shriek under too much strain while fire climbed the cables and people called it impossible even as they burned. Lira shut the memory away before it could take her balance. Not now. One wound at a time. Footsteps scraped behind her. A pair of laborers passed with hooks over their shoulders, talking in low voices about shift bells and dock fees. Neither spared her more than a glance. She let them go, then followed at a distance until the lane widened into the cart approach below Tanner's steps. This was where it would happen. A mule caravan from the eastern road, axle pin cracked from bad forging, wheel catching on a drainage rut, barrels toppling. One carter crushed at the hip, another pitched beneath the team, and a little girl carrying breakfast to her father struck by the second barrel when everyone lunged the wrong way. Lira had seen the blood on the stones the first time. She had seen the crowd gather afterward, clucking over fate. She was about to turn away. Changing this would be easy to notice. A shouted warning in the wrong place, a stranger moving before danger showed itself, and somebody would remember. Memory was a kind of lantern. If she lit hers too early, too many eyes would follow the glow. There were larger deaths ahead than this one. Names that mattered more. Fires that would spread farther. Her jaw tightened until it hurt. This was how the old bargains began, by measuring lives against each other until mercy became arithmetic. A flicker crossed the street. Lira went still. The lane before her seemed to double for the space of a breath. She saw the empty stones as they were, damp and gray in pre-dawn shadow, and over them a second image laid thin as frost. A wheel jerking sideways, splinters bursting from a cart rail, something bright spinning end over end through the air. The sound came a heartbeat later, not to her ears but inside her skull. A sharp iron snap followed by a child's startled cry cut short. Then it was gone. The street was only a street again. Her pulse hammered once hard enough to make her vision spark. Future echo, not memory alone. Something in the world had answered her return. The caravan emerged at the top of the incline exactly as she remembered it. Mule breath steaming pale, harness rings ticking, drivers hunched in patched cloaks. 3 carts, not 2. That was new. Butterfly edges already fraying. Lyra's eyes found the lead axle, the wobble almost too small to see, the strain transferring wrong across the right wheel. Below the rise, a girl in a red scarf skipped down the opposite steps with a wrapped loaf under one arm. Lira moved. She snatched a loose brick from the gutter and pitched it hard into the path of the lead mule. The animal shied sideways with a scream, stopping short. The sudden check jolted the train. Men shouted. The rear cart bumped forward, and the cracked pin on the lead axle sheared free with a metallic crack loud as a pistol shot. The wheel lurched off and slammed harmlessly into the tannery wall instead of dropping at speed on the slope. One barrel burst open in the street, coughing grain across the stones. The mule danced and kicked, but no one went under it. The girl in the red scarf froze halfway down the steps, eyes wide, loaf clutched to her chest. For one strange, suspended moment, nobody was hurt, and the city seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the nearest driver rounded on the empty street, searching for the cause of the fright, and Lira was already backing into the alley's shadow, the echo of the broken future still ringing faintly in her bones as she turned toward the deeper wards and the next name she had to reach before dawn. She had taken 3 strides toward the mouth of the alley when a hand caught the back of her coat. The driver smelled of mule sweat, wet wool, and old tobacco. His fingers twisted in the cloth just below her shoulder blade, close enough to the old scar there that pain flashed white along her spine. "You," he snapped, breath smoking between them. "I saw you throw something." Lira turned with her weight already dropped. She caught his wrist in both hands and folded it inward before he understood he had made a mistake. He grunted, knees buckling, and she stepped through the opening she made with his own body, leaving him bent over and cursing into the grain-slick stones. She did not run at once. Running drew eyes. She moved fast instead, cutting across the lane as men shouted behind her, a controlled urgency that looked enough like purpose to pass for innocence. By the time they understood she was the one they wanted, she was under the old wash bridge that linked 2 leaning tenements above the street. A fishmonger's boy stared at her from the gloom with a basket on his hip. Which way did she go? Someone barked from the lane behind. The boy's gaze flicked to her scarred face, to the knife at her belt, to the coin she pressed silently into his palm. He pointed uphill without hesitation. Lira slipped the other direction, through a slit between a shuttered dye house and a collapsed stair, into the service passage that ran like a crack through the bones of the district. The stone there wept mineral-cold water. Her boots found the familiar hollows without looking. She had bled in this passage once with a spearhead in her side, and Elena half carrying her by the arm, both of them laughing like fools because they had stolen 1 hour from death. The memory hit so hard it staggered her. Elena, alive, unwarned, still able to hate a stranger. Lira came out near the chain market just as the ward bell sounded the quarter before dawn. The sound vibrated through the ironwork overhead and turned the hanging links into a forest of low, metallic whispers. Shops were only beginning to open. Porters unbarred doors. Lanterns swung beneath the black ribs of cranes and pulley frames. She saw her before she meant to. Elena stood in the mouth of a forge-side storehouse, one boot on a crate, arguing with a broad man who kept shaking his head. Her hair was braided tight against her skull in the old practical way, dark with copper at the edges where the lantern light caught it. She was younger than the woman in Lira's memory by years, untouched by the white scar that should have split her lip later, untouched by the long grief that would hollow her eyes. She looked solid, impatient, alive enough to hurt. The broad man said, "No manifests, no release. I don't care whose apprentice you are." "Elena Marrow," Lira heard herself say before caution could stop her. The name tasted like ash and warmth together. Both of them turned. Elena's hand dropped at once to the hammer tucked through her belt. Her stare moved over Lira's face, searching for recognition and finding none. "Do I know you?" No, Lira thought, and the loss of it opened like a blade under her ribs. "You knew how I snored when fever took me. You knew which lies I told when I was frightened. You died with my hand in yours under the east breach while the sky burned green." Out loud she said only, "You're about to be blamed for a broken chain lift you didn't touch. Get the release hooks off crane 3 before sunrise." The broad man barked a laugh. Elena did not. Suspicion hardened her mouth. "Who sent you?" "No one. Listen to me. The outer brake on crane 3 catches high on the 5th pull. When they force it, the counterweight drags and takes the dock line with it. Everyone knows crane 3 sticks, not where it breaks." Elena's eyes narrowed a fraction. Lira saw the calculation begin despite herself. Good. That was the Elena she remembered, buried under youth and distrust. Not gullible, never that, but too intelligent to dismiss detail when detail could cut truth out of rumor. Then voices rose from the street behind them. 2 of the caravan men had reached the market. "There," one shouted. Elena's gaze snapped toward the sound and back again. "What did you do?" "Bought strangers a more expensive morning than they expected." Lira seized the edge of the nearest hanging chain and yanked. Links thundered down in a curtain between the storehouse and the lane. The broad man stumbled back with a curse. Before anyone recovered, Lira ducked past a stack of timber braces into the maintenance crawl under the loading platform. "If you want to know why your name is going to be in the wrong ledger by noon," she said, "follow me." For one heartbeat she thought Elena would let her go. Then wood creaked overhead, and another body dropped into the crawlspace behind her, moving quick despite the narrow dark. "You get one turn," Elena said. "After that, I decide whether to hand you over." Lira led her through the black underworks by memory and by touch. Here the city showed its hidden face. Rat-slick beams, tarred ropes, old chain housings sunk into the foundations, channels cut through stone to carry weight from the market cranes down into buried anchor rooms. She counted junctions under her breath. Left at the cracked support, down through the hatch with the missing rung, across the beam above the sump where 3 men had drowned in the flood year. The route came back to her not as miracle, but as old, painful knowledge paid for with other people's blood. At the last turn she stopped so suddenly Elena nearly ran into her. Below them, through a grill choked with dust, a chamber opened in the earth. She had never seen it from this angle before. Rows of ancient chain drums sat in the dark like sleeping engines, thicker and deeper than any market mechanism above, their load lines disappearing into the bedrock beneath the district. One of them was moving. Not much. A slow, deliberate tension, as if something under the city had just begun to draw breath. Lira stared down at it, cold spreading through her limbs with a clarity sharper than fear. The market cranes, the ward lifts, the breakages she remembered, the collapse that had seemed like scattered failures, none of them had been separate. The chain district had been built atop a single hidden dependency, something buried and load-bearing and alive in the city's design, and she had gone through an entire lifetime without seeing it. Behind her, Elena said, very quietly now, "What is that?" Lira gripped the rusted grill until flakes bit into her palm, and knew the answer waiting below them was larger than the one disaster she had come to stop. Lira did not answer at once. The chamber below seemed to pull at sound itself, swallowing the tiny settling noises that followed the drum's movement. Dust drifted through the grill in a pale veil. Beneath it, the iron cylinder turned another fraction, slow enough to doubt and impossible not to see. She forced her fingers to unclench from the rusted bars and kept her voice low. "It's the reason the chain ward dies before the rest of the city notices it's bleeding," she said. "And if we stay here staring at it, we'll die with it." She moved on before Elena could challenge her. The beam under their boots was old cedar soaked in generations of damp, slick as skin. Every step sent a faint complaint through the timber and out into the dark. The passage narrowed, then widened into a throat of stone where ancient masons had fitted blocks without mortar, each face cut so cleanly that even now no knife could have found a seam. Lira brushed one wall as she passed and felt cold sweat spring along her spine. The market district had always pretended to be commerce and noise, rope burns and shouted bids, but down here the city remembered another purpose. Weight was worshipped in these foundations. Pressure was guided, collected, and fed somewhere deeper. Elena kept close enough that Lira could hear the catch of her breathing. "You walk like you've been here 100 times." In a way. Lira ducked beneath a descending chain run black with old grease. The links swayed though no hand touched them. "That doesn't mean the path is the same." A flicker passed across her sight then, bright and vicious as a blade catching sun. For an instant the corridor ahead was full of sparks and screaming steel. She saw herself take 3 more steps, saw the floor hinge downward, saw Elena vanish into a shaft jagged with snapped teeth of iron. The vision struck with the hard certainty of memory, and for one desperate heartbeat relief flooded her. Forewarning. Useful. Then another image slammed over it. Same corridor, same 3 steps, but the stones held and a weighted gate dropped from above instead, pinning Lira through the shoulder while hidden chains reeled tight around her legs. Neither future matched the dust on the floor in front of her. Neither matched the fresh scrape she now noticed along the right-hand wall. She threw out an arm, stopping Elena so sharply the other woman hissed. "What now?" "Listen." They stood motionless. Beneath the long groan of buried mechanisms came a thinner sound, irregular and very near, grit ticking from a cut rope, 1 grain at a time. Lira crouched. At the edge of the walkway a hairline darkness divided the stone. Not a crack, a join. Someone had disguised a pressure slab with powdered lime and soot, but the cover had been marred by a recent boot heel. Not hers, not old. She eased backward, heart hammering. The future echoes had not lied. They had split. One belonged to the city she remembered. This one belonged to the city already changing under her feet. "Take that hook from your belt," Lira whispered. Elena hesitated, then obeyed. It was a narrow cargo hook, more tool than weapon. Lira lay flat on the cold stone and reached as far as she dared, sliding the hook into the seam. Her injured shoulder from another life seemed to flare in remembered pain, phantom and cruel. She levered upward. For a breath nothing happened. Then the slab tipped with shocking ease and the floor in front of them dropped away, revealing a shaft crowded with rusted counterweights. The cut rope snapped fully. One weight plunged, dragging the others after it. The buried gate above them crashed down where they had been standing a moment before, showering them with shards of stone. Elena swore and grabbed Lira by the back of her coat as the remaining lip crumbled. Together they sprawled against the wall while the shaft boomed below, deep enough that the final impact came like distant thunder. When the noise faded, Elena was still clutching her. Her face had gone bloodless in the dark. "Was that one of your ledgers too?" Lira peeled the woman's fingers loose, gentler than her words. "That was someone making sure nobody reached the lower works alive." They climbed over the fallen gate through a gap where one hinge had torn free. Beyond it, the underworks changed again. The market carpenter's braces gave way to older craft. Arches carved with worn glyphs, iron collars sunk into the stone, channels where old oil had hardened into black glass. The air smelled stranger here, less of rot and river mud, more of mineral heat, as if something far below had been breathing on these walls for centuries. Lyra's pulse would not slow. In her first life she had thought power in this city wore silk, signed decrees, sat behind polished tables. Down here power was older, blind, and patient. The passage ended at a round service room no bigger than a chapel apse. 3 chain lines descended through the ceiling and vanished into a central well. Beside the well stood a maintenance pedestal of green-veined stone, its top fitted with brass dials clouded by age. One dial had been cleaned recently. Fresh fingerprints streaked the tarnish. On the pedestal lay a wax stub still soft at one edge, a steel pick too fine for laborers' hands, and a square of folded paper marked with charcoal symbols Lira knew were not municipal. She opened it with numb fingers. It was a map fragment of the lower ward foundations, annotated in tight, deliberate strokes. One section had been circled 3 times, not the chamber above, not the trap they had survived, something farther down. Behind her, Elena said, barely above a breath, "Tell me that's yours." Lyra looked at the fresh marks, at the clean line where the paper had been torn from a larger sheet, and felt the future shift again, silent and immense, under the soles of her boots. Then she stepped toward the well and the dark below it, already listening for whoever had come here first. The chains answered when she leaned over the well, not with sound at first, but with a faint trembling carried through the stone lip into her palms, regular as a pulse, and too measured to belong to falling water or the restless settling of old foundations. Lyra crouched, holding the map fragment close to the brass glow of Elena's shuttered lamp. The circled mark aligned with a seam half hidden beneath mineral bloom on the inner wall of the shaft. Someone had come this far, found the lock, and tried to hide it behind the collapse above. She slid the steel pick into the seam and felt for the catch with fingers that remembered 100 desperate improvisations from a life already dead. On the third careful turn, something deep below gave a brittle click. A section of the wall withdrew inward, shedding dust in a dry hiss. Cold air breathed out of the opening and touched her face with the stale taste of sealed years. Elena muttered a curse that might have been a prayer. They squeezed through into a narrow stair wrapped around the outside of the shaft, old enough that the center of each step had been worn shallow by feet that no longer existed. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became, and the iron collars on the walls changed shape, thinning into elegant bands etched with symbols that looked less like craft marks than warnings. Lyra knew them anyway. In another life she had seen the same script copied onto war reports and excavation decrees, translated badly by frightened scholars. Containment, load, breach. At the bottom waited a chamber built in a perfect circle, its ceiling lost in dark, its floor split by a black fissure bridged with stone ribs. The 3 chains descended through the middle into a mechanism of interlocking rings bigger than a house, each one slowly turning around a core of dim red light. The motion was wrong. One ring hitched every 7th breath, dragging the others with it, and with each hitch the fissure below exhaled a shimmer that disturbed the edges of sight. Lyra saw, just for an instant, not the chamber before her but another one, cracked open, flooded with red brilliance, men and women burning where they stood while the city above screamed itself hoarse. Her knees nearly gave way. She had stood in the aftermath of this failure once, years later, when there had been no stopping the chain of disasters that followed. The market fires, the ration killings, the northern gate opening at the worst possible hour, Tomas with blood in his mouth, laughing because if he stopped laughing he would start begging, Mara reaching for Lyra through smoke while the ceiling came down. The memory struck with such force that she had to brace one hand against the wall to keep from being dragged into it. "Elena," she said, and heard the rawness in her own voice, "if that core fractures, this ward won't be the only one that dies." Elena lifted the lamp, light shaking against the moving rings. Can it be stopped? Not stopped, Lyra thought. Not without tools, not without time, not without changing 10 choices she had already made just by coming here. But maybe delayed, maybe bent. The old reports had mentioned emergency dampers, manual releases used during the first great failure, before the records were buried and the blame was sold upward into politics and myth. She circled the mechanism, reading the half-legible engravings with the desperate intimacy of a woman searching a battlefield for one living face. There, 3 recessed sockets in the outer housing, one packed with grit, one smeared with newer oil, one empty and bright from recent use. Someone had already begun the breach. She jammed the fine steel pick into the first socket and snapped it off to make a pin. Elena, catching her intent without another question, drove the maintenance crank from the pedestal into the second. Together they heaved. Rust screamed. The ring lurched. Heat rolled out of the fissure in a bitter wave, bringing with it the smell of charred copper and something older, almost sweet, like flowers left too long on a grave. The third socket would not take her knife. Lira tore the iron clasp from her own cloak and rammed it in with the heel of her palm until skin split across her knuckles. The mechanism shuddered hard enough to throw them both sideways. Then the hitching rhythm changed. Slower. Not gone, but wider apart, the strain redistributed with a groaning protest through the chained housing. The red light at the core dimmed from blood-bright to a banked coal glow. Time, she thought wildly. It was only time, but it was time. Relief hit so suddenly it hurt. She bowed her head, breathing through the copper taste of her own blood, and for one reckless moment she let herself imagine the shape of a different ledger. Mara alive long enough to hate her for old arguments. Tomas drinking bad ale in a room that still had walls. Streets not littered with the cost of her hesitation. She had come back for all of them, for every face that had looked to her in the end and found her too late. Yet as the chamber settled into its new, fragile rhythm, she knew with icy certainty that this change would move other pieces. A fire delayed here might ignite elsewhere. A gate unopened tonight might stand open on another, worse hour. Mercy in one district could become famine in the next. The future had never forgiven theft. A whisper brushed the edge of her hearing. Not Elena, not the chains, not the hiss from the fissure. Lira turned toward the red core and saw her own reflection standing inside it, scarred in places her younger body had not yet earned, eyes hollow with a knowledge too vast to carry. The future echo lifted one hand to the stone ribs below and spoke in a voice like metal cooling after flame. "You were later last time, Lira Voss." Elena went rigid beside her. "Who said that?" Before Lira could answer, a slow, deliberate knock sounded from the stair behind them, as if someone had descended without hurry and found exactly what they had expected. Then a man's voice drifted through the dark, calm and impossible. "At last," he said. "Now tell me how you remembered my name before we ever met."